Hi everyone, today we'll be going over a research paper on incentive-based regulation. Mainly it touches on carbon taxes versus cap and trade, and it provides an analysis around the pros and cons of each, and some of the conclusions revolving which policy would be preferred. So in terms of the agenda, we'll start with an introduction. We'll then go over dimensions along which of the two options are when they're equivalent. And then Spencer will speak through when the choices between the two policies makes a difference, and ultimately a conclusion on how it adds up in terms of which policy would be preferred. As a brief introduction, carbon taxes and cap and trade system are both referred to as incentive-based regulation because they rely on market incentives to both reduce pollution and minimize cost control. So the paper ultimately examines the relative attraction of a carbon tax, a pure cap and trade system, and a hybrid option, which is a cap and trade with an exogenous price ceiling and or price floor. So ultimately, the paper sort of shows that the various options are equivalent along more dimensions than are often recognized. And the key finding is that exogenous emissions pricing, whether that's through the carbon tax or through the hybrid cap and trade system, has a number of important attractions over pure cap and trade. Mainly, these two systems, the hybrid cap and trade and the carbon tax, are both exogenous systems. And as a result of that, because price is sort of known exogenously, it prevents price volatility, it reduces expected policy errors, it avoids problematic interactions with other climate policies, and it also avoids potential wealth transfer to oil exporting countries. So for our next part, the main attraction of carbon taxes and cap and trade for the emissions pricing policies is that its ability to achieve emissions reductions at a lower cost compared to more command and control policies such as direct regulations, mandated technologies, or performance standards. And the background the paper introduces is that although there's a wide agreement among economists as to potential advantages of emissions pricing, there is debate as to which particular form is the better climate policy option as it relates to carbon taxes or cap and trade. So recently, cap and trade has been gaining a lot of traction in the past few decades, but there has been interest in introducing carbon taxes in the US. And this is mainly due to the fact that US policymakers are sort of discouraged that they're unable to pass federal cap and trade legislation and now are setting their sights on carbon tax. So in terms of some of the arguments and propositions, several analyses have claimed that carbon taxes are superior to cap and trade in terms of their ability to achieve fair distribution of policy burden between polluters and consumers, preserving international competitiveness, and avoiding problems associated with the verification of emission offset. However, the paper suggests that these criticisms are also kind of unwarranted and argues that both systems, if properly designed, the two approaches have equivalent potential along each of those dimensions, and the two policies are more or less so equivalent. So now we'll go over how policies that specify emissions prices exogenally have several attractions relative to policies that do not. So emissions prices that are exogenous under the carbon tax is because the specified carbon tax rate is ultimately the emissions price, and consumers and producers both recognize the tax rate and the ultimate emissions price. And in a hybrid system with cap and trade, that establishes a price ceiling and price floor are also exogenous in that consumers and producers both realize what the price ceiling and price floor is. And ultimately, we went over how there's sort of these four benefits that are beneficial when the prices are exogenous rather than endogenous in a pure cap and trade system. So now we'll consider some of the factors that makes the two policies between cap and trade in a hybrid system and carbon taxes equivalent. So the first is that one argument is the uneven distributional impact. So the author goes over a model first in the cap and trade where initially P0 and Q0 are equilibrium with pure competition. And first, it sort of mentions how firms will incur cost of C per unit of output, and also their cost of remaining emissions is R. So ultimately, the policy under cap and trade will create this wedge between C and R, and then it'll create it at Q1, and it'll make the producer price P1. So ultimately, there's two ways in a cap and trade system to sort of allocate these allowances. The allowances could be sort of allocated through a competitive option where the producers bids for these allowances, or the government can give them away for free. So if it's for a competitive option, all the producers will sort of bid away the positive economic rent. So as a result of that, the loss of consumer surplus would be A, B, G, and F, while the loss of producer surplus would be the trapezoid F, G, H, and I. And instead, the government would gain from the auction the area A, B, E, D, which represents the government revenue that would be able to receive from the auction, and this could be redistributed through tax cuts. If, however, the allowance is introduced for free provision, area A, B, D, and E represents the rent that's given to producers instead of the revenue given to the government. And as a result, freely allocated allowances might mitigate the burden of reducing emissions on the producer end, as this economic rent is given to the producers instead. Next, we'll consider the carbon tax system. So the situation where carbon tax are taxed at a rate equal to the market price of allowances under cap and trade. So in this sense, the carbon tax is also taxed at a similar rate, which results in a price P1 and results in a quantity of Q1. So as you can see that the two graphs are mainly, in a sense, pretty equivalent in that firms pay the price of the emission for every unit of pollution generated. And in that sense, the producer still faces the loss of F, the trapezoid, F, G, H, and I. So in that sense, carbon tax also mimics the same outcome under cap and trade for free allocation of allowances as well. In this sense, carbon tax can be sort of altered in that it can grant a tradable tax exemption for a certain amount of emissions. And under that condition, it can sort of produce a similar effect as the cap and trade. And the offer concludes that with these two systems as set up properly, there are sort of no inherent differences in distributional impact amongst the two approaches. And ultimately, here the offer sort of lays out some of the issues related that critics have drawn around potential differences between the two systems, and how he believes that if altered properly, the two systems sort of create the same amount of effect, regardless of which policy is chosen. So the first is regarding incentive to reduce emissions. So under cap and trade, we know that allowances can be introduced for either auction or free allocation. But so the issue is that critics concerned that free allocation eliminates the recipient's incentive to reduce emissions. However, we see that although allowances are received for free, each additional unit of emissions carries an opportunity cost. And the opportunity cost is that one more unit of pollution either reduces the number of allowances the firm can sell or raises an amount that they have to buy. So thus they offer the same amount of equivalency in regards to the carbon tax system. And we sort of discussed the distribution of burden across industries in our example with the two graphs previously. In terms of international competitiveness, this sort of argues that having these two systems, a nation that moves ahead of its neighbors in terms of climate policy can put its own carbon intensive firms at a disadvantage. And critics argue that a cap and trade system could be better for this because it's introduced downstream, where more so it's not where the combustion happens, but it's downstream producers. And this implies less need for subsidization of basically oil producers. However, with this, the offer argues that a carbon tax system can also be introduced downstream by allowing these firms to have tradable exemptions for a certain amount of emissions. So in that sense, the two systems can be structured the same way. Lastly, it relates to the connection of offsets. And even under a carbon tax system, provisions for offsets can be added or left out, similar to a cap and trade program. So in that sense, the author argues that as long as a carbon tax system is structured in an appropriate way, it basically results in the same outcome and equivalency as what it would have been under a cap and trade system. Now I'll pass it off to Spencer, who will discuss the differences between the two policy instruments.
Thanks very much, Alan. The third section of the paper presents a discussion of the factors upon which carbon tax and cap and trade systems differ. And this is an important discussion to have because it guides the implementation of both systems, as well as kind of highlights key areas in which cap and trade might be more advantageous over carbon taxes, as well as vice versa. And so the first kind of point of difference that the author looks at between the two systems is the idea of administrative costs. And to get a good understanding of administrative costs, it's important to understand what the author means by upstream versus downstream emissions. And so, as Alan alluded to earlier, upstream really refers to higher up in the supply chain, where kind of a few key producers are creating products or services that are going to be used by the masses that will eventually lead to emissions. And downstream is, of course, closer to the consumer end of the market and involves perhaps millions or orders of magnitude more points of monitoring. And so it's natural that the administrative costs are higher as you move towards downstream in the supply chain, as there's simply more things to monitor and enforce. And so when thinking of the carbon tax system, there's an overall kind of low level of administrative costs because you're not necessarily enforcing or even needing to monitor how many emissions each producer or consumer is emitting. Rather, the monitoring happens for the evaluation of the progress towards abatement. So if the carbon tax system is working or not, essentially, is really the only reason you would need to monitor emissions. The cap and trade system, on the other hand, it is required that you monitor each consumer or producer's emissions and enforce the allowances that they are given. Further, there is an additional administrative burden on whatever regulatory body to track changes in ownership, because a key part of the cap and trade system is that trade part, and facilitating those trades of allowances is important for the system to work. And that is, again, another administrative burden that will ultimately work to increase administrative costs. Now, cap and trade, as well as carbon tax systems, can be designed to be upstream and downstream solutions, contrary to kind of the assumption that carbon tax systems are primarily upstream, whereas cap and trade systems are primarily downstream. The approach for each can be tailored to what you are trying to regulate the most. In terms of volatility of emission prices, this is the kind of next point of differentiation that the author looks at between the two systems. And the author finds that price volatility is virtually non-existent under carbon tax regulations. So this is an important point for implementation. If the price of energy or the price of emissions per se is extremely volatile, stakeholders that are trading in the markets or are in the markets for emissions are going to have a harder time adopting any system that's implemented. And so the cap and trade system itself, one weakness is that the supply of allowances is perfectly inelastic, or highly inelastic at least, and that can lead to major price volatility. And now when you compare that add that to the graph on the right, you'll see that in the short run, demand of allowances is also highly inelastic. And so when you have little fluctuations in supply and demand, this can lead to relatively extreme changes in price. And so this makes kind of economic rationality a little bit more difficult from the standpoint of producers and consumers of emissions. The author then goes on to talk about how firms or shareholders are able to address uncertainty and kind of the comparison between carbon tax and cap and trade. The author argues that under a carbon tax regime, emissions and the level of emissions is relatively uncertain, although there will be a goal in mind. However, the price is relatively certain, with taxes and tax rates changed in a very public way, as well as long lead times before any significant changes in the tax rates. The prices are well known in a carbon tax environment. With cap and trade, on the other hand, the emissions number and the quantity of emissions is relatively certain, as suggested by that cap. However, the price upon which allowances or emissions will trade in the market is something that is uncertain to firms and producers. And so, when thinking of practical implementation, businesses and certain shareholders that have an economic interest in knowing the price are going to support a carbon tax, as well. Different ecological groups and environmental regulatory bodies are more concerned about the sheer number of emissions and the quantity upon which CO2 is being released into the atmosphere. And so emission certainty is the primary factor of importance, and thus those type of groups are likely to favor cap and trade regimes. And so just understanding those differences is important when thinking about the practical implementations. And further, cap and trade systems seem to have a better ability to adjust to uncertainty. And so if there are, kind of exogenous changes in certain input prices, the cap and trade system is well suited to adjust expectations and adjust economic behavior in real time, as opposed to a carbon tax, which is a little bit more of a blanket and binding regime. Now, the paper goes on to consider other important factors and other points of differentiation between the two, finding some ambiguity among some aspects. But to quickly run through what the author discusses, the first being interactions with other climate policies. So the author finds from previous literature, as well as just kind of general economic intuition, that carbon taxes maintain an advantage over cap and trade systems, as they allow supplementary climate policy to generate larger reductions in emissions. Cap and trade systems, they don't seem to have any really significant synergies between other climate policy initiatives. And so carbon taxes have the advantage under this factor. Secondly, wealth transfers to oil exporting countries. One of the concerns here is that wealth will be transferred to oil exporting countries under a cap and trade regime. The economic rents to domestic firms or households will be lost or can be lost to energy exporting countries, again, supporting carbon tax. Thirdly, budget discipline and tax reform. Carbon taxes are better suited to maintain revenue neutrality, so long as the revenue from taxes is used directly to mitigate any risks of distortionary effects that can arise through either carbon taxes or cap and trade systems. Fourthly, potential linkages for across jurisdictions. And so there will be the need, as these programs become more common, to harmonize and allow for potentially synergies between different programs. And so a carbon tax and a cap and trade program, the offsets may be added or left out. And so this is an ambiguous effect, and one that is going to be a very region-specific thing, but nonetheless important to consider. Fifth, the potential for greater cost effectiveness from broad sectoral coverage. So cap and trade has a greater ability to achieve broad sectoral coverage and cost effectiveness. So this is a point in favor of cap and trade. And finally, perceptions and political feasibility. And so there is strong initial support for cap and trade in the US. Until recently, carbon tax has been gaining further favor. And this is an important point because, no matter what geographic location the shareholder or the agent is acting, the political perception of either regime is going to be important and does lend itself to whether or not the program will be successful. And so a consideration of all these factors is important when deciding which regime to favor. And finally, the paper concludes and sort of ties everything together. And this can be seen in the chart presented by the paper. And so, again, just to kind of summarize, the administrative costs are favored by the carbon taxes. And you can see from the rest of the chart how each one compares. Now, the question marks at the bottom are ones that suggest there is a little bit of ambiguity to whether or not carbon taxes or cap and trade favor that particular factor. However, the author concludes by saying that the debates to attempt to reach an understanding of the relative virtues of both the carbon tax and the cap and trade, as well as the hybrid approach, will continue. And it is important to recognize the virtue shared by all three. Each approach is a form of emissions pricing, and each provides flexible and permanent incentives for emissions abatement that are absent in other forms of regulation. All three approaches have the potential to bring about greenhouse gas reductions in a way that is cost effective and equitable, as well as being environmentally friendly. So this concludes our report, and thank you for listening.